You can only stay on the sidelines for so long. These are unprecedented times.
In my recent Mencius Moldbug video, I attempted to create a grand new theory of conservative politics. I want to use that video as a jumping off point. I'm going to launch a new series of videos critiquing various American institutions and explaining how they've become corrupted. Number 1. The courts. If you want to see a decayed political institution where nearly everyone involved acts in bad faith, then go visit an American courthouse. Let's start with the judge, the most important of the court officials. In most cultures, judges are known for their great wisdom and their ability to steer legal proceedings towards a fair and equitable outcome. To do their jobs effectively, most people would agree that judges need not only have knowledge of the law, but also a deep sense of moral wisdom. If you look at common law crimes in colonial America, you'll see how much influence morality had on our legal system. Things like profanity, blasphemy, and working on the Sabbath were considered crimes. Jurors were seen as reflective of the moral consensus of the community, and they judged not only the guilt of defendants, but they also determined their sentence. The burden of proof for a criminal conviction in America has always been beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden of proof was not a product of the Enlightenment. Instead, it's a product of the Christian disgust with the unfair trial and execution of Jesus Christ. I'm not saying this to glorify the past or to say that we need to return to it. What I'm saying is that an underlying morality is important for a healthy legal system. It's bizarre that over time, our criminal law has become less about morality and more about procedure. Property rights have become the ethics of the criminal justice system. But property rights are not a substitute for actual morality or ethics. They never have been, and they never will be. Instead of focusing on the wrongdoing of the accused, the focus was increasingly on the conduct of the government. Did the government violate the defendant's rights? Was the defendant's arrest proper? Did the defendant receive his Miranda warnings? It wasn't long before the courts realized that this approach they were taking was obviously wrong. Property rights couldn't possibly be a substitute for actual morality. So like the universities and the mass media, the courts swallowed the blue pill. They decided that they could solve this problem by becoming progressive. This began the court's futile quest to fix property rights and turn it into a proper morality. This shift is best illustrated in the constitutional right to contract. Prior to the Great Depression, the Supreme Court had declared that the U.S. Constitution protected an individual right for a person to enter into any contract he or she wishes. Because of this, labor regulations like a minimum wage, overtime, or workplace safety regulations were unconstitutional. The Supreme Court clearly violated its own precedent when it struck it down. This established a precedent that progressivism could be used as a pretext in order to ignore legal precedent and ignore the text of the Constitution. It is after this point that the courts abandoned their role as part of the government of the United States and instead joined the Cathedral. Recall Moldbug's theory that progressivism is actually a type of decay. By abandoning traditional morality and legal precedent, the Supreme Court decayed the institution of the courts. For example, in criminal cases, 99% of criminal defendants plead not guilty at the arraignment. However, there's no possible way that nearly all accused criminals are innocent. Most of these not guilty pleas are made in bad faith. Acting in bad faith is the accepted norm for litigants in America's courts. In criminal cases, the prosecution no longer focuses on the morality of his goals and objectives, but on whether he's satisfied the myriad of objectives created by the courts that indicate a defendant's rights have been complied with. So what happens? Justice became arbitrary and frustrating. Recalling my Moldbug video, the courts are just one of 3 branches of the Cathedral. They are the only branch that is an actual official part of the government. The legislative and executive branches are controlled by the similar but somewhat different neoliberals. Now the neoliberals get it. They understand that the courts are now playing on a different team. Because the courts and neoliberals agree on most things, this doesn't tend to be much of a problem. The neoliberals are concerned nonetheless over the socialist bias that the Cathedral has. They rightfully recognize the immorality of the Cathedral and distrust it for this reason. To deal with this problem, the neoliberals take institutional power away from the courts through mandatory minimum sentencing. The neoliberals realize that without mandatory punishments, the judges would use their position to advocate for progressivism by not punishing criminals. Now, the neoliberals differ from the Cathedral on the issue of economics. They prefer a libertarian economic system over the Cathedral's preference towards socialism. Neoliberals therefore recognize the necessity of punishment of those who violate people's property rights. Through its feuding with the neoliberals, the courts engage in what I would call the liberal arms race. Number 1. The neoliberal government constantly moves to expand its surveillance over its citizens for the purposes of protecting property. Number 2. Our courts ought to balance this against our interest as citizens to our own privacy. Number 3. Instead of placing limits on surveillance, the courts instead create new procedures that the neoliberal government has to go through in order to conduct its surveillance. Number 4. This allows the Cathedral to conduct its own surveillance and also check the power of the neoliberals. Of course, the courts are perfectly willing to sign off on whatever sort of surveillance the neoliberals want, unless of course that surveillance is being conducted against members of the Cathedral. Number 5. The courts give the illusion that they're creating new rights and protections for citizens. In reality, though, these are not rights, they're just procedures. This allows both the neoliberal government and the Cathedral to become more powerful, while at the same time eroding our privacy. Number 6. This is what Mencius Moldbug means when he talks about how the Cathedral manufactures consent. Meanwhile, the courts have cannibalized other functions that the government traditionally served. Many progressives today like to complain about how the police are being used to deal with problems like mental health and drug addiction. The reason that police are used to deal with these issues is because of the progressive Supreme Court. The progressive Supreme Court ruled that the state had no authority over people with mental health problems unless it first convicted them of a crime. Thus, our justice system has become further divorced from its origins in a shared authentic system of morality. Meanwhile, our courts spread false pseudo-morality through legal decisions based largely on myths and legends propagated by the courts. Roe v. Wade is a perfect example of this. The immorality of Roe v. Wade should be obvious to everyone. Even if you support abortion or think that it's good or necessary, you ought to recognize that the Supreme Court addressing a deeply moral issue by applying a legal solution is in and of itself immoral. Even worse, the idea that the U.S. Constitution protects a right to an abortion is based on pure myth. The word abortion does not appear in the Constitution. The Founding Fathers were familiar with Socrates' radical interpretation of gender egalitarianism, which included abortion on demand. Yet our Founding Fathers did not include these views in the Constitution. The idea that abortion was some brand new thing that was created after World War II is also wrong. As proof, I'll include a link in the description to a transcript of a criminal trial that took place in 1911, where a woman was prosecuted for the crime of abortion. This is a perfect example of how the Cathedral spreads pseudo-morality based off of nonsense. The Cathedral demands you listen to their experts, their scientists, and their judges. After you peel back that appeal to authority, though, all you end up finding is a demand that you accept progressive political arguments that aren't justified on any legitimate moral basis. Number 2, the lawyers. The United States has 4.7% of the world's population living within its borders. Yet somehow we have ended up with over 70% of the world's lawyers. You would think that would mean that the United States is a very lawful society. In fact, the complete opposite is true. The US is amongst the most violent countries in the world. 22% of the world's prisoners are imprisoned in the United States. Our inability to address rampant drug addiction has led one of our wealthiest cities to be dubbed dirtier than the poorest slums of Mumbai, India. Another one of our wealthiest cities has had its centrally located police precinct taken over and occupied for weeks by violent anarchists and looters. Meanwhile, the wealthy seem to be afforded endless opportunities to break the law. Labor laws just don't seem to apply to companies like Uber. Antitrust in the United States has become a complete joke. A billionaire who is running a child sex cult gets a sentence of house arrest. When he gets arrested again for the same thing, he gets assassinated in jail by some other corrupt conspirator. So what are the 70% of the world's lawyers accomplishing exactly? Spreading pseudo-morality and encouraging people to act in bad faith. LegalEagle is a perfect example of someone stooging for the Cathedral. Is it just me, or is stooging for the Cathedral somehow magically linked to how successful you are on YouTube? Look at me, everyone. I'm a licensed attorney, standing in front of a bookshelf full of big books. You need to listen to me. When I talk about politics, I'm not giving you my personal opinion, but the consensus of expert lawyers like myself.
The rule of law is being eroded, little by little. And frankly, I'm sick of it. So I'm going to do something about it. I'm suing the White House, the CIA, the Department of Justice, and a whole bunch of others. This is not a joke. This is actually happening.
Notice how he acts like you just need to take it for granted that what he's saying is true.
But one of the legal issues is that as a former national security advisor, in order to publish a book, Bolton had to go through an onerous pre-publication review process. During the course of that review process, the government would likely take out a whole bunch of information that it doesn't want to be published. And I didn't trust the government to do that pre-publication review and censoring of John Bolton's book in good faith. Under normal circumstances, but doubly so when we're talking about things that strike at the heart of our democracy and the president's impeachment trial.
It's amazing to me how progressives now love John Bolton. This is a guy who fought hard to get us to go to war with Syria, with Venezuela, and North Korea, all at the same time. Millions of people would have died if John Bolton had gotten his way. Yet this douchebag lawyer is now filing lawsuits to White Knight for John Bolton. Why? Because Bolton snaked on Trump. You see, this is what happens when you live your life according to a fake pseudo-morality.
So the point of LegalEagle's FOIA requests was to obtain, or at least force the government to properly process these redactions under FOIA. Information that the government was attempting to prevent John Bolton from publishing in his book. And we also sought to obtain information about what process the government was using. Were there any political considerations in terms of preventing John Bolton from saying certain things? And did the government prevent him from saying unclassified information that he had a right to say because it was politically damaging? Not surprisingly, the government has stonewalled our FOIA requests. So we're filing suit. We are suing the government, the White House, the CIA, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and a whole host of other federal government agencies to find out what they prevented John Bolton from saying.
Has this guy ever filed a FOIA request before? I remember when I filed my FOIA request to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It took them 3 years to send me the records. By that time, I told them not to even bother because the information was now useless to me. The federal government is horribly understaffed. Despite doubling our population since 1950, federal employment has decreased dramatically. For example, the White House has only 377 employees. Let's assume for a second that all 377 employees devoted themselves to processing FOIA requests. The White House would still struggle to deal with the avalanche of bullshit FOIA requests filed by conspiracy theorists like LegalEagle. But good luck with your lawsuit. I think you're about to find out that the federal courts are also horribly understaffed and inefficient.
This is actually what happened when Jason Leopold of BuzzFeed filed a FOIA request and eventually a lawsuit to enforce that FOIA request for the original Mueller report. We got a lot more information about the vague redactions that the DOJ had actually done to the initial release of the Mueller report, and we found out that a lot of those redactions were completely improper.
More information on the bullshit Mueller investigation? Who cares? Robert Mueller indicted 12 Russian nationals for spending around $2,000 on political Facebook ads during the 2016 election. Only about half of that money was spent on ads that were put on Facebook prior to the election itself. Robert Mueller then used this as a basis to investigate General Michael Flynn. After convicting Flynn, the conviction had to be tossed out because of prosecutorial misconduct and the withholding of exculpatory evidence. If that weren't bad enough, the leader of the Russian troll farm voluntarily entered the United States in order to fight the charge against him last year. A week before the case was supposed to go to trial, Robert Mueller dismissed the indictment. He did this because he had no evidence. The whole thing was a massive lie, a plot that was orchestrated by the Cathedral.
Here because allegedly one of the government employees cleared John Bolton's entire book for publication, only to have that decision changed at the last minute by a political appointee. A political appointee who had basically zero training in terms of overclassification. It's entirely possible that this whole process is rife with political machinations designed to hide the White House from unflattering information that should see the light of day.
You do realize that John Bolton worked as an advisor to the president. He was not an unelected bureaucrat hired out of merit. You're not entitled to know everything the president told to John Bolton in confidence. Just like I wouldn't be entitled to know things that your clients told to you in confidence. Of course, that would require you to have actual clients. I keep forgetting that I'm not listening to a real lawyer. I'm listening to a fake YouTube lawyer. LegalEagle is not going to lead you to some sort of objective truth. He's not using his expertise as a lawyer to reveal what's really going on. He's instead trying to sell you the pseudo-morality of the Cathedral. Listen to our experts, our scientists, and our lawyers. The reality is, though, LegalEagle has no legitimate moral authority. There is no reason for you to give his political opinions any more weight than you would any other person. If anything, his membership in a profession that encourages people to act in bad faith makes him even less of a moral authority. But anyways, that's all I've got for this video. If you liked it, let me know. I am planning on making this into a series. If you're not subscribed to this channel, please support small YouTube channels like mine by subscribing. Thanks.